Kat, welcome to the Always Better Than Yesterday podcast. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing so well. Thanks so much for having me, Ryan. I'm super excited.
It's so cool. I'd love to say, like, this is not just an interview about having a cool title, because it's so much more than that. But you do have a really cool title. I want to get that out on the table at the very start, and then I want to hear more about you. I want to hear more about your story. So, what do you do in the world?
Oh Lord, so many things. I'm only guessing that by my cool title, you're referring to the one that's called the Director of Belonging. Is this what we're talking about?
Absolutely, yeah. What a title that is.
Yeah, crazy story how that came about. But I personally think an even cooler title that I have is Mom.
Yes.
So that's how I'm in the world, is fundamentally as a mom. And I think that actually all of my work comes out of um, that experience of identifying myself in a dyad.
Mm,
Because I think so many of the problems we experience with loneliness and disconnection have to do with individualism gone wrong,
mm.
and really taking the individual person as the fundamental unit of society. And I'm like, nah, did you birth yourself? I don't think so. You came into the world tied to another human being. And so I actually like to talk about how all of my methodology and things for helping people create belonging in their lives is really rooted in the experience of knowing your interdependence as a human being. And I experienced that most profoundly through motherhood.
So powerful, isn't it? Because there's we live in a generation of self-ease and self-love and self, and that's really powerful. I too shared a similar experience. I became a leader at the same time as I became a parent, and I grew up in the policing world that was trying to teach me that leadership was about rank and hierarchy and status. And becoming a parent is so transformational, isn't it? I've heard you describe it that you've learned your studies in the trenches. What does that really mean?
Yeah, so I have this fancy degree from USC in philosophy, where I also tried to study my way out of the experience of loneliness academically. And guess
Mm.
what? Plato was not very helpful. Poor guy, because that's all head knowledge,
Yeah.
right? And what we're after is an experience as a whole person in life of living connected, not just knowing the 6 hacks for how you're supposed to do it.
Mm.
Um, and so, uh, I studied it and I got good grades, but that didn't translate into my ability to
Mm.
experience it, right? And so it wasn't until I became a mom, like I said, and sat my butt in a strip mall Starbucks for several years, that I began to actually, in these very small moments of time, over a long period of time, become comfortable with letting someone sit down across the table from me, listening to them, caring about them, finding myself to be curious about them. And it was that organic process of being present in a place with a very simple organic process of caring,
Mm.
that I began to realize not only am I capable of connecting, but I'm capable of creating a sense of immediate belonging for this whole wild array of human beings, none of which I would probably pick out in a police lineup as my people, right? Or like my tribe or something like that. And so I then discovered through that experience, really my life calling to help other people be able to create this wherever they are, whoever they are,
Mm.
this kind of connected life. And I did it by um, living out of it, right? So I wasn't some researcher dropped into a coffee shop on a mission.
Mm.
This was my life. These were my friends, and they helped to save my life when my life exploded. And so everything I really have to offer is much more in the vein of practical wisdom,
Yeah.
and really helping people see themselves as having that themselves. We all have stories and experiences and things we've learned, and continuing to help people not turn me or anyone else into a guru, but
Mm.
really being able to realize, no, I'm wired to know how to do this. And it was only going to come by them living in the trenches of their own. So that's how I know whatever it is I know that's of any value.
Yeah, you've lived it. And
Mhm.
you talked about calling, and I think, my experience of helping people with their calling, it's there's two common paths. There's one is the passion, you love helping people with something, and the other one is pain and helping other people avoid the pain with which we've once experienced. How would you describe your pathway to your calling?
Uh, I I guess, I spent the first 2 decades of my life chronically lonely.
Mm.
But and so I feel like my whole life was organized to make that stop.
Mm.
But I didn't have an awareness or an intentionality about doing that. It was like this really elemental drive somewhere deep in my brainstem that was like, your life can't start until you have some kind of,
Mm.
foundation, or matrix of being connected. So my whole life was organized probably to, you know write that foundation. And then once I had the opportunity to actually experience what I had been needing and looking for my whole life, I think at that point it became a passion. And it wasn't a passion just to stop other people's pain, it was a passion to help them realize how much is possible.
Mm. I love that. And as I understand it, you were in Los Angeles at the time, and you think there's millions and millions of people. How could you possibly be lonely in a city full of millions of angels? And how would you describe loneliness?
The worst thing ever. It's literally the worst experience I think people can have, which
Mm.
is quite a statement, because I know that there are just horrific human rights violations, and we probably don't need to be ranking these things. But um, I feel like with loneliness, there's so much, research and things like this that have been coming out over the last 5 and 10 years, but I still think it fits in most people's minds as like a royal bummer. Like,
Mm.
man, I'm just like bummed. I'm lonely, right? But the fact is, loneliness increases your mortality rate by 29%.
Right.
Fact is, the experience of loneliness lights up the same area of your brain as physical pain,
Mm.
right? And so I like to use extreme language to help us get shocked out of how we're
Hmm.
sidelining it often with action and not funding, interventions and stuff, by saying, no, no, it's like more like dismemberment. You're experiencing being dismembered from society.
Mm.
That should shock you. It is more like exile, which is the worst punishment that they could even come up with in the ancient world, because they knew that people couldn't survive outside
Mm.
of outside of their village and social networks. So it's the worst thing ever. I mean, the textbook definition is a perceived sense that the quality of relationships you need isn't there.
Mm.
And I'm like, that's nice. No lonely person is saying that.
No,
So there's
no.
there's this right there's this big difference between people who work on these issues and how they talk about the
Yeah.
experience, and how people experience it are talking about it. And most of the time, people experiencing loneliness aren't even aware they're lonely. They don't
Mm.
have the language, they don't have the concepts, and if they even did, what spaces are there to talk about it,
Mm. Mm.
right? Even amongst friends, it's not something that's often talked about.
And then when you add that to the self-focused generation, I guess what that means is that we think then the problem is one of self. There must be some
Um,
kind of flaw about me. There must be something wrong with me, rather than this bigger community that is
You're
missing.
smart. You're smart. I like you. I'd like you even if you weren't smart. But that's like super perceptive. I've been like thinking about that a lot, because as all of these suggested best practices come out and things like this, um I think that there's a real danger in privatizing the problem
Mm,
And because people who are feeling lonely, guess what? They all already think that there's something wrong with them. And
mm,
that's why they're feeling it, even if they haven't articulated that to themselves most of the time, unless it's some kind of loneliness that's just purely circumstantial, like you've changed cities or you've changed, to a new life stage. But most people are walking around feeling like, oh my God, there's something wrong with me, like existentially,
mhm,
right?
mhm.
And so then if we're like giving them assets and resources that are like reinforcing that there's just more stuff they should do,
Yeah.
that essentially is often like assuming they're extroverted, assuming they've already got a certain set of personal tools and opportunities in their context. It really, really bothers me because it's like putting an extra burden on someone who needs to
Yep.
be unburdened. And really, what needs to
Mm,
happen is, what do people need in that state? If you're lonely, you need connection. You don't need a pamphlet.
mm,
And so, where are the bodies? Where are the bodies who are willing to show up with their
mm.
time and their energy and their eye contact and their non-judgmentalism and actually give a crap? Because I'm like not real happy with all the pamphleting that's going on.
And you just said non-judgmental. Like, I've been around the kind of the kind of parenting circles, and there's a lot of self-conscious thought that goes in. Oh, am I parenting well enough? Is it good enough? What are they thinking of me? I've not really, what do I look like? If I like, how do you create the bridge of humanity in those Starbucks? What did you learn? I know that you've got your own model now and things like that, but what were some of the basics that you really stumbled across in your time,
That helps people be non-judgmental.
or bridges that connection and with other human beings?
Yeah. I mean, there's like, I kind of try to think about it in two ways. One are like, what are the tactics you're employing? Like, what are the behaviors you're doing that do that create that possibility? And then what are the internal attitudes and dispositions that do it, right? Because I could go up to 50 people in Starbucks and make eye contact, but if I'm thinking like, I don't care about you, you're in my way,
Mm,
that's not going to work, right? Or if I'm
yeah.
sitting there thinking, oh, I love all the world and all the lonely people, but I never actually look at anyone or say
Mm,
anything to them,
mm,
right? So these two things go together. So the really basic idea is to be present somewhere in public or somewhere where there are humans. Like,
mm,
I mean, it seems so basic, but the amount of times that we're secluded, and aren't putting ourselves in what we can think of as high connectivity spaces, um, you know, is shocking. So, start paying attention to the places that you already are. You're already at the market, you're already at the bank, you're already on Zoom, why are we jumping over those people and those contexts to get to somewhat imaginary tribe of people that
mm,
are disembodied floating around somewhere?
mm,
So we have to be like real about where we're already at and start there. And then it really is the super basic ideas of looking at people, initial conversations that are at an appropriate level, talking about things that are in the shared space or shared
mm,
environment, and actually asking questions that demonstrate you want to get to know someone.
mm,
Those are the basics of creating space, asking questions, listening, and being willing to share as well. And from there, it's really an improv art form. There's I get questions all the time like, well, how do I get it to like deepen and like, and I'm like, well, you just increasingly share more of your story, more of who you are, and you take these mini trust bids, right? You don't walk up to someone and tell them your whole medical history, or I don't recommend that. But you share a little bit, you see if they engage.
yeah.
Next time you share a little bit more. So but we often aren't taught these things. And so we can get real blocked. The
Mm,
positive things to do aren't rocket science.
mm,
More so the problem are all the internal anxieties and fears that we have
mm,
that are
mm.
the weeds that are cutting us off from doing these basic things.
I love that. There's an Indian guru called Sadhguru, and I'm reading his book Karma at the moment. And in it, he said this one thing that kind of just blew my little mind, which was that the human state of striving can sometimes leave us in this state of a mirage, like it's not that it isn't there, and that it will always be in the horizon. And I think that's such a call to action to gratitude in the moment, isn't it? Being present and seeing. I think it links to kind of what you just said in terms of don't look beyond what's already there with you.
Hmm. Yeah, and if you look at it long enough and from the right angle and open yourself to what it is in and of itself, without its usefulness per se to you. I mean, how many of our poets in general have affirmed that all of the world can be found in a grain of sand? If we slow down, what's required to do that? We slow down, we attend to the thing, we behold its context and its purpose outside of us, and then that combination of things over time moves us to internally care,
Mm,
because we can't really care about the things that we haven't slowed down to pay attention to and beheld in and of themselves, right?
mm,
Everyone walking past us was somebody's baby. Every one of them has a backstory, has dreams, um, beyond who they voted for or beyond who they do or don't worship. Right? Like,
mm,
so being able to form a practice of internally doing that can blow open our sense of what's possible in even the most boring contexts we find ourselves. Because guess what? This should not have happened to me in a crappy strip mall Starbucks in Los Angeles.
mm,
So to me, it's like if something can happen transformatively there, and not just for me, but for hundreds and thousands of other people who are very
mm,
different from me, it really has to do with how are we showing up for each other, and
mm.
who are we willing to be for each other.
I'm going to ask a curious question because it's on my mind and I can't let it go. Is how do you take your coffee?
You're assuming I drink coffee.
I am assuming you're right.
You know what? I'm not just saying this because this is a UK podcast, but I do English breakfast tea with honey and milk.
Wow. Okay. Honey as well.
Honey.
Wow. Okay. Cool. That's good to know. I owe you one. So
Mhm.
I get your heart for belonging. I get your heart for eradicating loneliness. But how does one become a director of belonging?
um, I don't know. I don't know if there are any other ones.
Mm,
So the way it happened for me, and which I don't recommend to anyone else because it's quite a journey. Other than if you consider yourself as a director of belonging in your own life, then I'm prepared to have everyone see themselves that way.
mm,
But in terms of it being a role at a fancy institution, I'm an alumni of USC and had zero friends while I was there for the most part till the very, very end. But I stayed connected with a couple of the professors and a couple of folks who still work there. And about 5 years ago, the university started having a loneliness crisis, and
mm.
they just weren't equipped to handle it because what do you do? Send 40,000 kids to the counseling center? It was a problem with them not finding meaningful friendships and community quickly enough.
Mhm.
And so there weren't people who were stewarding that kind of knowledge
Yeah.
at that time. There weren't really loneliness experts who were specializing in innovation
Yeah.
around these things. And so they knew of the work that I was doing in the coffee shop, the work meaning my life, that I was living in the coffee shop, and how ridiculous it had become. It was spilling out of the cafe and turning into all these, family like relationships. And so they approached me and were like, whatever you're doing here, is that something that can be translated into another context? And I'm like, do you got people? Because this is a people thing. So I'm sure there's always, right, contextual
Mm,
differences, but the universal need is the same. And often this sets of weeds or problems that prevent us from connecting are there's not an infinite number. There's a pretty small subset of them that just wear different clothes. And so anyway, they're like, okay, well, we're not going to make it worse by trying. So they were like, kind of gave me carte blanche. I'm very, very grateful that there were very open-minded innovators on the inside of the departments that were shouldering a lot of the crisis. And so we just started where it was easiest to start, which was they already had a mindfulness platform of non-credit courses. And so they're like, can you create some kind of 5-week workshop that helps people unpack their social experience together and just get talking, right? Because the biggest problem is when we don't talk about it and it remains in the dark and gets super loud in our own heads. And so I'm like, yeah, sure, that's like just a bigger coffee table. So, I created this course, and then I'm like, well, where the heck do I start? I had lived it, but I had never tried to teach it. And so that's how I developed this acronym CLICK, because we needed a catchy 5-week thing. And I'm like, there's got to be something. It's not sacred, but it should be pretty intuitive when you look at it. I'm not, creating something ex nihilo. That this is just connecting as you are, where you are, listening first. And that's both to your experience and to the person in front of you, investigating without judgment, communicating kindness, and keeping in touch, such that if you remove any one of those elements, it's like stuff falls apart or it doesn't really get off the starting blocks. And so I just structured some experiences around that with the main goal of alerting these humans, these precious humans, to the fact that they're already wired for this. There's nothing wrong with them. In fact, they're actually a gift to everyone they're around, just with their own presence and who they are. And then you're just getting them talking about their experiences. And it's a lot more just facilitation, honestly. So then out of that grew a million other kinds of experiments there. And they were like, hey, what do you want your title to be? And I was aware that in the UK, you guys are like ahead of the curve with, organizing around this stuff. And I knew there was a minister of loneliness. And I love the fact that there's funding and attention going to that. But I'm like, no, I don't want people to keep saying loneliness every time that they think about this, because loneliness is the obvious, sane reaction to not having belonging, right? It's like focusing on hunger rather than like on providing food sources. So I asked to be director of belonging, and they're like, haha, that's funny. Like that and cool. Or wait, are you serious? I'm like, yeah, why not? Yeah, why not? And I thought it was like hysterical. To me, it was hysterical to call it a director position, right? Because in university settings, people like assume all kinds of things about what that means, right? And it's ironic because everything that I actually do is to undermine my own ability to direct jack squat, and to, so cut the guru thing and just put the responsibility and opportunity onto people to be able to be the authors of their own experience. And so it's kind of, that's how it emerged. And I think it was very helpful just as a placeholder, a conversation starter, so that other universities, for example, are like, oh, whoa, they have a what? Why don't we have one of those? We have loneliness too. So it's been a good launch pad to get to have some of these more rogue kind of conversations around the topics.
I love that. And I'm glad that you mentioned the it's completely got out of my head. But yeah, the title and the responsibility of having it in the right places, because it can be quite easy to say, oh, that's just Kat's thing. Kat's dealing with the loneliness thing. And I guess, how have you then tried to help leaders of leaders? How have you helped to try to create, a culture, shall we say, of belonging?
Yeah, right. It's like a whole systemic thing that has to change, right? So my approach is like all the things need to change, right, towards orienting towards this kind of bottom line, or rather, this is a foundation. Like there can be no economy, for example, if there are not humans who are connected to each other. So this is truly a foundation for the rest of what's possible in society in any industry. Um, and so everything needs to change, but there is no utopia that we're working with. So you can't just say, we'll start with the leaders. Like, well, a lot of the leaders are a lot of the problem. So what you have to do is start with whoever's willing.
Yep.
So I start with whoever's willing, where there's least friction, fewest permissions needed, and where you can fly under the radar. Because
Mm,
once you start getting the
mm,
transformation, it's like yeast in the dough, like it will start spreading.
yeah.
So I don't get particular, I don't like honor org charts at all. They're fossils.
Mhm.
What I'm interested in is the organism. So who are the people who are catalysts of this already? And it's often not even part of their job description.
Mm,
But the
mm,
people who are leading relationally in any organization, how do we start spotlighting them, honoring them, getting them together to start integrating their efforts and pulling in the
mm,
same directions? So when I talk to like leaders of leaders, I'm basically like, you need a relational map of your organization that's pointing out the people who are already doing this work, and you need to start paying them way more money than you're paying them.
mm,
Because until the kind of labor that's actually creating belonging for people is recognized, identified, honored, and compensated, it's
mm.
all going to be a bunch of programmatic crap. And then we're like, woo, we did the belonging workshop. Look at us go. And I'm like, you have this generally woman, you have this woman over there who's like working overtime to
Mm.
like care about the people on her team or in her, whatever. Is she getting paid for that? What happens if she stops? Right. And so I'm like, I have like this real passion to be like, there's already people on the inside of every organization who knows how to do
Mm.
this and is doing it, or the organization would have collapsed.
Yeah.
And so starting to honor those people throughout the system, start to give them language for what they're doing, because most of the time they're leading intuitively. They're just caretakers, or they're just nurturers, or they just, have very high EQ, or however you want to think about it. But starting to give them language for what exactly they're doing,
Mm.
um, and how to do it even better, how to take care of themselves in the process. That's where it needs to start. And the people who know that needs to happen, but aren't one of those people themselves, they need to be releasing the funds to allow those people to do their work and to let it organically grow.
Mm.
It's like you can't, right? Like if you're making, I don't know why must be hungry. I keep having all these food metaphors, but I'm
It's
like,
all good.
if you want to make sourdough bread, what do you need? You need a starter. Who are the starters? And I don't mean innovators. I don't, mean rock star millennials.
Mm.
I mean, who are the people who their presence makes people feel okay in their own skin? You have to start with those people.
Mm, I love that. I'm so glad we're having this conversation because you speak a language that I really connect with, really resonate with, and how, because a lot of the listeners to this show, they are leaders, they are heart centered leaders. I'm bringing good people like you to help expand their vocabulary, their experience of what's possible when it comes to heart centered leadership. How can we encourage them to become Wi-Fi hotspots?
Oh my gosh. I think just the first thing is just to like, right? The first part of any kind of change is vision,
Mm,
right? And I think being able to both articulate like a real kind of generic but cool vision, that that's something that's possible
mm,
for anyone to become, and that probably they're already on that path. Most people are somewhere on that continuum. um, and to encourage them to get more fine grain about what that could look like in their life.
mm,
What would that mean for how they feel in their own mind and own heart and own body? What would they
mm,
be doing in the spaces they're in and the interactions they're in? What would that look like, feel like, and require? um, and so once you have some kind of vision, you uh, are then into, do I have the intention to follow through with this? How do I stay on track? Do I need a couple people to help me stay on track with this within my org, across orgs? And then you're into the means. What are the practical, tactical things that I'm going to do? Am I going to pause after people talk to me in the meeting? Am I going to, set up a workshop for my team leads to be able to tell their backstories? Right. So we have to be careful to not jump. People want to jump to tactics and programs really, really quickly. But I think it won't go very far if you aren't doing the heavy lifting of understanding that your own experience is what's going to like be the thing that radiates the field that other people can then hook into.
I'm conscious of your time. Where do you see the future going with loneliness, belonging as we come out of global pandemic? What would be your vision?
I hope we get to a point where instead of trying to get rid of loneliness, we start to try to befriend it. And I know that's kind of abstract, but loneliness is a natural reaction to decades, if not centuries, of a lot of social problems that we did not consent to and have inherited. And so I think the more we can stop warring against it and trying to make it go away, and more try to understand why it's there and the unmet need that's causing it, and befriend it in each other, that gives us a much better starting point to have conversations. And so there's catalysts and innovators and politicians, really coming together in a lot of different kinds of coalitions. I'm part of a global one. The Who was getting involved, not the band, although they're welcome too. They belong here too.
100%.
So there are tons of efforts that are like tribing up and finding each other to move forward on all fronts. So, loneliness and sort of now belonging have been very zeitgeisty for the last couple of years. COVID has essentially like ramped that up, but you're always in danger of this sort of thing slipping off the radar because it's such a weird kind of, where is it? It's everywhere, it's nowhere, it's hard to hold on to, it's extraordinarily complex. And so my hope is that we can start to create an ongoing set of conversation spaces where this can just be part of how we live our lives, as opposed to like a disaster intervention, where why aren't we talking about our social experience? Like, period. Like, isn't that healthy? Like, I talked to you about my exercise routines. So I'm hoping that the conversation gets normalized and that it turns from being avoiding a problem to embracing a possibility.
Let's just say you're hypothetically writing a book. Like, what would that book be about?
That book would hypothetically be called You Belong Here. And yeah, ask me how long I've been working on the proposal. Way too long. So yeah, I mean, what I'm trying to do with You Belong Here is to try to give a really fun and compelling universe for people to get in touch with what their own social experience has been, understand their life as sort of inhabiting a social jungle, and what do we need in order to be able to rewild our social landscape and find our way home to each other again. And that's going to involve a little bit of philosophy. It's, with big ideas about what's going on, but primarily dropping people into their lived spheres of influence and actual context that they're in, and empower them to start visioning for their future and taking the first initial steps.
I look forward to the day that drops through my letterbox, and I'd hope that you'd come back on and be willing to talk about your book on another episode in the future. And on a TEDx stage, it'd be good to see the message getting out.
Ryan.
Yeah,
I would love that. If there are any TEDx organizers listening, can you please find me? I'm always looking for ways. I don't care that it's about me, but every time I teach at USC, for example, I'm like, it's not fair that only 15 people are getting to have this conversation together.
Yeah.
So I'm always just looking for ways, like, I think every single human has a right to explore this with other people who are supportive and find mutual aid and mutual wisdom. So, any ways we can do that, I'm on board with.
Well, I'm going to go a step further and suggest that Brene Brown has you on her podcast. I'm going to suggest that Brene interviews you, the director of Belonging at USC, because she talks about a lot of this stuff too, and I definitely think that you have a heart for it that needs to be shared, my friend, for sure.
Oh, Ryan, you're so kind. There's almost no one on earth I would rather meet. Very highly respect her and the impact that she has, and all about extending the sisterhood.
Absolutely. How can people connect with you? Where can they find out more about the good work that you do in the world?
Well, the easiest way is through my website. I admittedly don't update it as often as I should. My secretary is currently my cat, so so it's just me. But I would love to hear from you through my website. It has a contact form, and really, I'm very, very passionate about joining other leaders, specifically who you've just gathered this incredible, like around this incredible, not just idea, but way of being. I used to do this thing called the Mother Clucker Collaborative, where I was trying to collect women who led relationally, to just give them support and validate their methods and stuff. But this is such a cool group, and I love joining leaders who are in the middle of a process, right? They're having to scale, or they're like reorganizing, or they're trying to do something new. And to be their friend by their side, to be thinking about how to build with belonging as a foundation. So if there are people who are interested in that kind of collaboration, they stay behind the wheel, but that's the lens that I can bring.
I love that. What does the phrase "always better than yesterday" inspire in you?
Oh, it's such a beautiful phrase, isn't it? It sounds like it's a poem. Um, for me, what that conjures up most is a perspective or a worldview that insists on finding the good
Mm.
and focusing on the good amidst, you can focus either on the blackness of the sky or on the ways in which the blackness only makes the light shine brighter. Which, sorry if that was incredibly cheesy,
I like
but
it.
no, that's what it makes me think of, is that if we choose to focus on the good,
Mm.
that's what we increasingly become filled with and perceptive of around us.
Kat, I admire you and the great work that you do in the world. Thank you so much for your time today. And I'd be honored if you'd leave us with a final thought from your good self.
Oh, you're so kind. Well, I'm so grateful to be meeting you and to find out about the community that you're creating. Um, I think maybe my final thought is I'll quote the person who was the first encounter I had with a Wi-Fi hotspot of belonging in college, who absolutely changed my life from the inside out just by standing in the threshold of Metaphysics 360 with his keys jangling in his pocket. And he became my mentor. And after everything started in the coffee shop, and I'm like, oh my gosh, what is happening? This feels like everything, but like I'm not doing anything. I went back to his office, and his name is Dallas Willard. He's now passed away. And I was like, Dallas, like, this is what's happening in my coffee shop. What is going on? Is this everything, or is this like, am I making this up? And he looked at me and he said, this is everything. To be with and for each other as we are, where we are, is everything. And we organize our lives to death to avoid this, because it requires that we slow down and risk being known. And I just want to say it's worth the risk.
That was powerful. I love that. Thank you so much, my friend. Take care.
Thank you, Ryan.